Good afternoon and welcome to everyone attending today in Mathematica's Washington, D.C. office, as well as those of you who are joining us via webinar. Before we get started, please let me remind those of you in the D.C. office to join us for the networking reception that we'll host after the forum here in the 12th floor lobby. I'm Ann Person. I'm Mathematica's Director of the Center for Improving Research Evidence, or CIRE. At CIRE, we seek to bridge the gap between policy research and practice by providing a variety of research methods and evaluation approaches in diverse settings. For our discussion today, we'll explore research to guide the adoption, replication, and scale of evidence-based programs through the application of the developing field of implementation research. Implementation science. Sorry about that. I'm thrilled that we have one of Mathematica's senior researchers, Diane Paulsell, to speak to us about her work using implementation science. Diane will also facilitate the panel discussion and lead the audience question and answer session. Our distinguished panel of guest speakers include first, Lauren Suppley, Director of the Division of Family Strengthening in the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation within HHS's Administration for Children and Families. Next, we'll have Allison Metz, who is co-director of the National Implementation Research Network and senior scientist at Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. Finally, Deborah Joy Perez, Vice President of Research, Evaluation, and Learning at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, will speak. Each guest will provide us with their unique perspective on how federal agencies, foundations, and program leaders can use the evidence generated by implementation science to improve program implementation and quality. Please note that we're video recording today's session, so some of you may be captured in images here in the DC office. The video will be posted on our webinar, from the webinar later this week on our website. So to help ensure the highest possible sound quality for the webinar participants, we ask that everyone please silence all of your electronic devices. Thank you. So with that, I'll pass the podium to Diane Paulsell.
Thank you, Anne. I'm pleased to moderate today's session, and I look forward to hearing from our panel of experts. I'm going to share with you our goals for today, provide a definition of implementation science, there we go, and provide a brief review of the implementation knowledge base. First, I'd like to share with our audience today's learning goals. After you leave this session, we hope that you'll be able to answer the following questions. What is implementation science? How can implementation science inform your work, whether you're a researcher, practitioner, a policymaker, or a funder? What gaps exist in the implementation knowledge base? And what are the most pressing implementation research needs? To ensure that you leave the webinar with the ability to answer these questions, throughout the course of our presentations, we will ask the audience several reflection questions, giving you the opportunity to reflect on the presentations and draft your reactions or questions for the speakers, some of which we'll share later during the panel discussion. Both the webinar and in-person audiences will be able to participate. For the in-person audience, we ask that you simply draft your thoughts on a note card. The webinar audience will be able to respond from the webinar question and answer widget on your screens. And please note, at the conclusion of the presentations, comments from the panel, we will entertain questions from both our in-house and the webinar audience. So now let's move to the first learning goal. What is implementation science? It is the study of how evidence-based or evidence-informed practices and innovations are adopted, replicated, and scaled up in diverse settings. I've listed here a sample of common research questions in the implementation science field, and I expect our panelists will be touching on all of these today. When is an organization ready to adopt a new innovation? What supports and systems are needed for effective implementation? What organizational and contextual factors support or impede effective implementation? What dosage and quality of services must be provided? What strategies are effective for engaging participants? How can innovations be adapted for replication in diverse settings and with different populations? So in recent years, there has been a growing interest in using interventions with evidence of effectiveness to improve health and well-being. Federal agencies have launched a range of initiatives that require the use of evidence-based strategies in areas such as adolescent pregnancy prevention, home visiting, and education. At the same time, there is a well-documented gap between evidence about effective interventions and their use by practitioners. Replicating the positive effects of an intervention requires much more than simply deciding to adopt an evidence-based program. So there is an increasing recognition across disciplines of the importance of implementation research to guide adoption, replication, and scale-up of programs. And even for interventions that don't yet have an evidence base, there's a need to use implementation research to guide intervention development, demonstration programs, and efficacy trials. So to take stock of progress in building the implementation knowledge base, my co-authors Patricia Del Grosso and Lauren Suplee and I took a look at research in one field, early childhood home visiting. We thought this would be a good field to use as an exemplar because it is a very common service delivery strategy and it has substantial funds invested in it. As of 2009, an estimated $500 to $750 million was being spent on home visiting annually. And then a provision of the Affordable Care Act provided an additional $1.5 billion over 5 years for early childhood home visiting. And this resulted in a large scale-up of evidence-based home visiting programs across the country. This is also a field with a relatively rich body of research. The Home Visiting Evidence of Effectiveness Systematic Review had identified more than 10,000 citations on home visiting at the time we conducted our review. So we reviewed 178 research articles that discussed implementation of 22 different program models of early childhood home visiting, and we also reviewed the practice guidance available for those models. We assessed the state of the knowledge base to support the development of practice guidance, supports for practitioners, and effective service delivery. We also cataloged threats to implementation fidelity identified in the literature, and we cataloged the data sources and methods used to measure implementation. So I'm going to give you just a 2-minute summary of our findings to set the stage for the rest of the presentations. And if you'd like to know more, I've given you a citation for our article at the bottom of this slide. So what we found was that most of the home visiting models we reviewed had fairly well-specified practice guidance and supports available, such as technical assistance, trainers, and training materials. About half of the models also had fidelity standards and monitoring systems to help practitioners make sure they were implementing the model as intended. About half of the articles we reviewed reported on dosage or duration of services and the qualifications of home visitors. But less than 20% reported on other important dimensions of service delivery, such as caseload sizes, supervision, fidelity, quality, and participant responsiveness to the services. Only about 36% of the articles, covering 6 of the 22 models, reported on threats to implementing with fidelity to the model. They identified issues with program design, insufficient training or supervision of home visitors, staff turnover, and various types of problems connecting with families. The most common data sources used in the articles were program records and interviews with staff or staff surveys. Few studies collected data on participants' perspectives, and many of the articles did not report on data sources or collection methods for the implementation information they reported at all. So these are our main conclusions from the review. While some practice guidance is available, there are many gaps in our knowledge, and some guidance may not have taken into account the reality of constraints many implementing organizations face in providing things like training and supervision. And you won't be surprised to hear me say that more implementation research is needed to inform practice and technical assistance. For example, effective mechanisms for recruiting and retaining high-risk clients, and thresholds for dosage and quality of services. We found that while some models had set thresholds for dosage, for example, a 90-minute home visit every 2 weeks, for the most part, those thresholds were based on theory rather than empirically based. So we need more plan variation studies to test different implementation strategies, different levels of dosage, program adaptations, and so on. Okay. So I think the bottom line here is that all of us, whether we're practitioners, researchers, TA providers, or funders, really need to up our game in the area of implementation to realize the promise of evidence-based programs and innovations for producing meaningful outcomes and improving well-being. And that's why I'm so thrilled for you to hear about a lot of exciting work that our panelists are doing in all of these areas. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Lauren Suplee.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you very much to Mathematica for inviting me to come here. I mentioned to Diane when I was prepping that you don't have to really twist my arm to come talk about implementation science. The problem probably will be keeping to my time. So I was asked to come here and give the federal perspective on implementation science, and I think it would help to first start to say sort of where am I coming within the federal government. I work in the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation in the Administration for Children and Families, and for those who don't know the office, we're the primary research and evaluation shop within the Administration for Children and Families. So we have a very applied focus to the work that we do. Our mission is, first and foremost, to advise the Assistant Secretary for Children and Families on program improvement and evaluation work. And so that really makes us ask the question constantly, so what's the meaning behind this work? Why is it useful to programs and policy? And right away, implementation enters that conversation. And second, we really see our role as helping to set the scientific agenda around methods of evaluating human service programs. And so implementation science in this advancing field falls squarely within that work. So in the policy context, implementation research comes up in a number of ways, and I'm just going to give 3 quick examples. First is when we're talking to our program partners and policymakers about our work, the common questions we get is sort of how did it work? Why did it work? How would I actually continue to do this? And those are all questions that fall squarely in implementation science. So when we're starting to design our studies around implementation, we highlight these are the kinds of questions that can help inform improving programs and policies. Second, we've had a pretty large role in the scale-up of evidence-based policy and some of the systematic reviews, one of which Diane mentioned. And one of the things those reviews do is really highlight gaps in the field. And when we released a number of these reviews, what we hear from state administrators and others when they look, they say, oh, that's great that that model is evidence-based, but I need to know, would this work in my community with the resources I have? How would I actually train the staff to do this? So in the home visiting evidence of effectiveness review, we actually have a detailed set of implementation information to respond to those questions, but it's only as good as the information that's available in the field. And then finally, as we're scaling up evidence-based programs, everyone talks about how effect size attenuate when you go to scale. We don't understand why, and that variation is really a lot to do with implementation. So better understanding implementation helps us understand how and why impacts vary at scale. So it's pulled the implementation science to the forefront. And I just want to make a side note. When I talk about implementation, sometimes people talk about it as sort of the components related to programs, such as a coaching component or the training and technical assistance. Other times when people talk about an evidence-based model, they would say coaching is an integral part of my model, so I don't consider that the implementation question, but I'm going to use the term quite broadly to include both of those. So when I first came into federal research, what I saw was a lot of descriptive studies, or some people use the term process evaluations. They really were there to describe what happened in a demonstration evaluation, to contextualize the impacts, and they were typically a very small part of the budget of our projects, usually qualitative, maybe some quantitative descriptive statistics, and really not intended to generalize. They really weren't looking necessarily to look at the broader field. How does this particular implementation component contribute to that larger conversation? But as the field has gone on, implementation has reformed, and I give a lot of credit to NIH's Dissemination Implementation Initiative that really codified this as a scientific field. In response to that, OPRE holds these methodological advancement meetings, and we had one in 2010 about implementation research methods. And in that conversation, we really talked about that these methods were important for theory building, to understand impacts, and also we needed to start looking at study designs to actually look at implementation variables as the dependent variable. How do we actually look at how to improve training programs? So at this meeting, there was definitely a call for more rigorous research to answer these questions, but there are definitely some challenges that I'll put out there, and I don't think we've resolved these since 2010. First is that methods that we have typically are linear, and implementation is complex and dynamic. So it's hard sometimes to know how to study these things, even if we know they're conceptually or theoretically important. There's still a lack of consistency of measurement across trials, so it's hard to build a theory without actually understanding how all these studies fit together. There's definitely still a challenge of studying implementation at scale. Many times we're looking at variables such as an organizational capacity or community context. You need a large N to study these things, and it gets very expensive very quickly. And then finally, really trying to understand how much of what we're learning about implementation science crosses domains. Is it, if you find something in the teen pregnancy world, does that also replicate in some other human service program? It's something I think we need to wrestle with. So for the rest of my comments, I'm going to talk about the portfolio of work we have in OPRE as some examples. And I wanted to borrow from the recently released Common Evidence Guidelines the National Science Foundation and the Department of Ed put out. And they really focused in these guidelines on impact research, not on implementation. But when I looked at it, I thought it was a nice framework. So largely, the studies group into 3 buckets. So these foundational research and early stage exploratory work, design and development work, and then efficacy, effectiveness, and scale up. So within OPRE, within the foundational research bucket, you're really looking at developing and testing, refining theories, trying to understand connections. Many times this is still qualitative or descriptive and sometimes correlational. Some examples of some of our projects are a descriptive study of TANF Tribal Child Welfare Coordination Grants, which is a set of grants that were issued and people wanted to understand sort of what's going on, how are they rolled out, and what kind of activities are happening. We have a sub-study within our Parents and Children Together study that's looking at fathers engaged in responsible fatherhood programs and trying to learn from the fathers what brought them to these programs, what are they hoping to get out of these programs. And then a sub-study within our Head Start Cares project was on coaching to try to understand the interactions between a teacher and a coach as it's happening. So we have audio tapes of those sessions, trying to understand those processes. So some of the research questions in these studies include what are the levels and characteristics of service provision and coordination in these grants? Are lead teacher psychosocial variables associated with fidelity of implementation? And why are participants particularly interested in attending these programs? Within the design and development research, this is sort of in the middle where we've got some theoretical backing and we want to understand a proof of concept that would lead towards rigorously testing. This again can be qualitative, descriptive statistics, or it can be impact test of these ideas. So some examples are our Head Start Coaching Design Study, which was using the multi-phase optimization strategy theoretical framework that Linda Collins at Penn State has been talking about to understand within a strategy, sort of what are the elements, and using a fractional factorial design. So for example, within coaching, is it number of sessions, is it the relationship, and sort of can we actually vary these rigorously and test them? Our Migrant and Seasonal Head Start Cares sub-study, which was really looking at taking an evidence-based social-emotional program for preschools and seeing if it can be both culturally and organizationally adapted for a Migrant and Seasonal Head Start program. And then our very new project that was just awarded, our Building Bridges and Bonds, which is looking to, right now it's an evaluation structure, but the idea is that we will rigorously test within these questions about program functioning. So more effective strategies to retain men in responsible fatherhood programs. Some programs bundle services into one integrated set of services. Other times it's a menu of services. Are one of those options more or less likely to either retain or have stronger impacts? So some of these research questions are the feasibility of adapting an existing social emotional enhancement, this model of integrated services versus a menu of services, and the types of resources necessary to develop a coaching model within Head Start. And then the final bucket are these efficacy, effectiveness, and scale-up, which is really a lot of times embedded with the implementation science is embedded within the trials to better understand the conditions under which it's being executed, and also understand the counterfactual condition. So some examples of some of our projects are our Supporting Healthy Marriage, which was taking programs that had shown evidence of effectiveness for middle-income couples, marriage and relationship education programs, and trying them with low-income couples. The Head Start Cares project was 3 social emotional promotion programs for preschool classrooms and testing them in a larger set of situations across a set of Head Start programs across the country. And our Personal Responsibility Education program, which is one of the teen pregnancy prevention initiatives, looking at when you scale up these evidence-based programs, sort of what happens. So some of the research questions: will low-income couples even enroll and remain in these programs when they were offered in the communities? Did participation in a teacher training result in changes in teacher actions in the classroom? And how do states assess the quality, fidelity of teen pregnancy prevention sessions when they're rolled out at scale? And then finally, we've really also become very interested in this getting inside the black box. So understanding the intersection between implementation and outcomes, and looking at them as rigorously as possible using quantitative methods. So I just have 3 examples of studies, but I think this is an area where there needs a lot more methodological advancement. The first is our national evaluation of the federal home visiting program, our My Hope. A question they're asking: what's the relationship between features of home visiting programs and their effects on family outcomes? So programs that do more intensive training on breastfeeding, do they have larger impacts in breastfeeding? Within our Head Start Cares study, we're going to be doing some additional analyses looking at did sites with higher levels of implementation demonstrate larger impacts? And then our Health Professions Opportunity Grants evaluation, asking questions such as which locally adopted program components influence average impacts? How does variation drive impacts? So all of these are really exciting advances, and together this full portfolio we hope is advancing the field of implementation science. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleagues, and I'll be happy to answer questions about these studies in the Q&A.
Okay, please take a few moments to think about the presentation that you just heard and consider our first reflection question. What are your most pressing implementation research questions? Again, you can submit your responses to this reflection question or specific questions that you have for Lauren via the webinar using the Q&A widget, or in person using the note cards provided. And you can just pass your cards to the Mathematica staff member, Carmen, over there. And we'll use your responses to inform our panel discussion in a little while. And now I am pleased to turn the podium over to Allison Metz.
I hope the mic's working okay. It seems to be working okay for everyone. Yes. Can you hear me? Perfect. So I want to thank Mathematica, too, for hosting this and having us here today. And this is a great group of women to get to stand up here with. And it's always nice to have a full panel of women. This is very exciting. So I was asked to really talk about the role of implementation science in actively supporting and providing technical assistance to jurisdictions who are implementing evidence or innovations. And so really it's thinking about the role of implementation science in supporting communities to use evidence in practice. And I think it's a critical topic because really the amount of resources, human resources, financial resources, both domestically and internationally, that we put into technical assistance. And so thinking about how is it that we can integrate science-based TA strategies, data-driven TA strategies, so that we are more effective in how we support jurisdictions in both implementing and sustaining evidence in practice so that we can improve outcomes for the populations that we work with. So I want to start with thinking about what the science of implementation has brought us in terms of kind of an overall formula for how it is that we feel that we can really achieve socially significant outcomes. And so thinking about this combination of effective interventions, which is where we really kind of started for probably the last couple decades, really thinking about evidence-based interventions and how we can move those into practice. And what the science of implementation has brought us are probably those second two boxes in this formula around what are effective implementation methods and the enabling contexts which allow us to move those interventions into practice and achieve those outcomes. I want to have the additional focus, though, throughout my comments today on this idea of who is installing those components of the formula. So I think that this is a movement we need to go to in implementation science, not just about thinking about the individual, organizational, environmental characteristics that lend themselves to good implementation, but who's installing them, and thinking about the roles of those key stakeholders. So in this schematic below, you really see in the inner context some of the players that we think about a lot: the service providers, funders, policymakers, developers, community stakeholders, intermediaries, which play a large role in the United States in moving evidence into practice. Thinking also about that outer context, those relationships, those social networks that are forming and leadership in jurisdictions that, while a bit maybe removed from the movement of evidence into practice, certainly play a role. So really sitting at the nexus of that is the infrastructure necessary for implementation and the outcomes that we hope to achieve. So what I want to do for a few minutes is take that formula and dismantle it a little bit. So when you think about what's in each of those boxes in the formula and how implementation science really informs that thinking. So when we're working with jurisdictions to implement an innovation or move evidence into practice, and we're using that formula to help guide our work, what are we really thinking about? So in that first box where it says effective interventions, we're thinking not just about the level of evidence, we're also thinking about the extent to which that evidence meets the need of the population of concern and the extent to which that evidence has been operationalized enough that we're able to implement it well. I want to use, it's always nice when you're up at a podium, you can make a comment that is important to you. I think that one of the challenges that we face with moving evidence into practice is the mismatch of evidence to local context. And I worry about that personally because I think that there are very good evidence-based interventions that might be being mismatched or used in certain jurisdictions, and then we're not getting the same impacts again. And I don't think it's always just a matter of fidelity or implementation quality. I think sometimes it is about, did we actually do a robust needs assessment, substantiate those needs, and select an appropriate evidence-based intervention or practice? And so when we think about that box and unpacking it, it's more than just the level of evidence. That middle box around effective implementation methods, there are kind of four things that fall in there, and they're very interrelated. The idea that we do stage-based work. Our center just did a review early in 2014 of 31 published implementation frameworks, and they all have stages, and they pretty much all have 4 stages. So I think we're feeling pretty good about that. The idea of implementation drivers, and for us that really just means the building blocks or the infrastructure, and all frameworks really talk about that as well, and some talk about it in terms of general or innovation-specific capacity or infrastructure that's needed. The idea of implementation teams, so how is it that we build local capacity to not only implement but to sustain that when certain external supports diminish? When developers leave or evaluators leave, people that play a role in that. And then the idea of improvement cycles. So I'll take just a few minutes and talk about each of these pieces. So when we think about stages of implementation, the idea that we move from exploring what it is that we'd like to do, which really involves that robust needs assessment, all the way to full implementation, which can typically take 2 to 4 years, where we're really realizing those child or family or population level outcomes that we want to see. I wanted to mention highlight in each of these stages that, yes, there are particular activities and structures that need to be focused on in each of these stages. This really helps us diagnostically as well as planning-wise from a TA perspective. So many times we might go out on site. A site could be implementing for 2 or 3 years, so that might seem like they're an initial or full implementation, but diagnostically, they're much earlier on. They might be in an installation phase, and that allows us to match our TA to their stage of implementation. So stage-based work is a critical piece of effective technical assistance. And also thinking about the type of data that you need to collect and use at each of these stages to help jurisdictions move evidence into practice. So as quick examples for exploration, you would be looking at needs assessment data. Installation, you might be doing things like culture, climate assessments, infrastructure gap analysis. For initial implementation, it's really effective to do usability testing so that you're able to collect metrics that help you not only stabilize, but many times optimize the use of evidence in practice during those early months and maybe the first year or two of implementation. And then in full implementation, it's allowing you to not only be assessing fidelity data, but really to be looking at those population outcomes. So the idea that there's different data at different stages for different purposes is a critical piece of providing effective technical assistance. I'm going to move through this piece. For the building blocks, when we think about the infrastructure, this is also really helpful. You'll hear me use the word diagnose or a diagnostic a lot. What implementation science gives us is that ability to do a good diagnostic when we engage with a site that is either implementing or is thinking about implementing an evidence-based practice or an innovation to change outcomes for a population in their state or their community. So another thing that's really critical to look at is the extent to which they have the capacity to install each of the building blocks that's necessary to actually achieve those reliable benefits at the top of the schematic there. So thinking about, do we have the workforce to select from? How are we going to train and coach and assess performance so that we're building competency of practitioners to do the new way of work? On the right side of that triangle, it's really about how we're building that enabling context, that hospitable environment. So it's thinking about technology resources, administrative resources, and systems resources that have to be in place and utilized effectively to really create the environment for an evidence-based practice or an innovation to thrive. And thinking back to that question in the beginning about the who, one of the things that we have found often is we know that those building blocks matter. The science of implementation tells us what about those building blocks matters. So there's best practices associated with how we train, how we coach, how we use data, how we align policy and practice. But there's less known about the accountability, what role different stakeholders play in installing each of those building blocks. And what we see out in jurisdictions a lot is a sense of ambiguity over whose role it is to not only install some of those building blocks, but to sustain them over time. So what's been really helpful is to think about those drivers of implementation as sitting at the nexus of all of those stakeholders. It's also very helpful because it takes away some of the negative impacts when we don't realize implementation as effectively as we want, and there's sometimes looking to certain stakeholder groups and kind of talking about what they did or didn't do. Rather, this helps us figure out how it is we identify the coordinated yet differentiated roles all of the stakeholders need to play to ensure that we have the infrastructure that we need. Implementation teams. This is the third in the pieces around effective implementation methods, that middle part of the formula. Teams really are key to capacity. So it's working with jurisdictions and ensuring that we're building, and depending on how large the initiative is, a teaming structure that is accountable for database decision making. It's really accountable for installing the infrastructure necessary and is constantly doing continuous quality improvement, really engage in collaborative problem solving. This is really helpful when you think about that previous slide I showed you around the role of all the stakeholders. It's really important to ensure that all of those stakeholders are represented on these teams if you really want to think about how you co-create the capacity that's necessary to sustain the use of evidence in practice over time. And then finally, we think about this plan, do, study, act cycle that's actually been in the literature since 1924. The challenge for us, though, is the extent to which there is the capacity, the resources, and the technical expertise in jurisdictions to use data to drive decision making. It's not just, for a long time, I think there's been a discussion around the reliability of data, our access to data, the amount of data we need. But I think we need to move the discussion a little bit further around building the competency, the confidence, and the capacity of jurisdictions to use their data. And so I think from a technical assistance perspective, that's one of the gaps that we see, is that TA is not as focused on the CQI process and really building the capacity of sites to do that work on their own. One aspect of that is really working with sites to be able to do that full policy to practice feedback loop so that they are able to detect barriers at a practice level and feed them up to the next level of the system when necessary. Finally, I started the conversation and I touched on it, I threaded it through this idea of the who and stakeholders. So I just want to give a couple kind of thoughts around that. That we know that stakeholders enter into initiatives with different understanding or assumptions regarding collaboration, and that stakeholders have trouble navigating the complexity of implementation and understanding their role. This has become a big interest of mine with large scaling of EBPs, of evidence-based practices, and thinking about the role of the public agency in relation to the developers and the service providers. And over the last year or so, my interest in that has expanded to the role of other stakeholders also involved. And Lauren and I have had a lot of conversations about this. So you can see on the slide, what we noticed from a lot of data collection on site, asking people about their role, is there is confusion related to who's responsible for building competency, who's responsible for communication, who's in a position to voice the unknowns or the concerns when initiatives move forward. And unfortunately, what we see is that this role ambiguity can actually increase from exploration to initial implementation, and it leaves initiatives really vulnerable to those negative effects of communication breakdowns, lack of clear decision making. This might seem counterintuitive, that you'd think we'd gain clarity as we move through. But many of the things that we do to reduce ambiguity and increase role clarity, we diminish those things over time. So during exploration, we're doing things like formal communication heavily when we're starting an initiative. As we move through an initiative, many times formal communication decreases, and what replaces that is informal communication and sidebar conversations. So we see this idea of people feel less clear about their role many times as they move through. And we know that there are interventions that we can put in place that actually reduce this ambiguity. So building cross-sector confidence in the evidence, developing stakeholder competency in the models themselves. We've learned in big initiatives we've had that stakeholders that are actually pretty far removed from service delivery still need to understand the underlying logic of the models, or they have a sense of ambiguity in their role. So policymakers and others need to know. Negotiating roles and responsibilities, that continuous quality improvement, having those courageous conversations, and really frequent and inclusive communication. So real interest in studying from a TA perspective and an implementation research perspective the role of these interventions and increasing that clarity so that folks feel a sense of shared accountability to sustaining the infrastructure needed to achieve outcomes over time. I think that's it. So I think I was a couple minutes over. Sorry about that. Okay. I'm going to hand this back over to Diane.
Okay, thank you so much, Allison. So again, please take a few moments to think about the presentation and consider now our second reflection question. In your field, what challenges are there to implementing evidence-based programs or innovations, and where do you see opportunities for implementation science to help you address those challenges? Again, you can submit your responses via the webinar using the Q&A widget, or you can hand the note cards over to Carmen, and we will be using these later in our panel discussion. And now I'm pleased to turn the podium over to Deborah Joy Paris.
Good afternoon, everyone. Very appreciative of the opportunity, Anne and Diane, to be here. I was told I had 10 minutes, and I'm going to shut this. Hopefully, I won't. If it shuts off, you can see me. That's me up there. So I'll start with a story. And the story is that about 15 years ago, in my last role, so I'm currently at the Annie Casey Foundation. Prior to that, I spent about 9 years at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And one of our key initiatives there was to reduce racial and ethnic disparities. And at the time, this was like the hot topic, right? Everybody was doing disparities research. Everybody, everywhere. And you put out a call for proposal, you would get like hundreds and hundreds of responses and proposals. But we noticed there was one key challenge, and that is that all of the proposals we were receiving were focused on problem identification. Disparities exist, disparities exist. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing focused on solutions. Nothing focused on, interventions that resulted in improving the issue of disparities. And even in the literature on the research on, when there was research on interventions, it was completely absent of any process information, any information about implementation, any information about the people, the how, the what, the why, and all of those things that mattered. And so we, at that time, decided to create a new program called Finding Answers, Disparities Research for Change. And the focus of this program was explicitly on identifying solutions. And we would only fund evaluative research on interventions for solutions. And that was pretty kind of contrary to what was currently happening in the literature. And to our dismay, part of that project was a systematic review of evidence in cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and depression. And we found very, very few studies had done, after a review of hundreds of studies, that had actually provided information on solutions. So I want to start with that context. So to me, it's very related to implementation science and where we're headed. And again, let me say thanks to the Center for Implementation, Improving Research and Evidence. And I would advocate to the folks at Mathematica that you might slap a P on there to say improving research, evidence, and practice, because I think that's where we need most of our investment today. So, as you've heard, implementation science is really about asking us to identify ways in which we can promote the uptake and adoption of evidence into kind of routine settings. But, there's an implication there, or an implied understanding that the uptake of that research is relevant, that there's buy-in, that there's systems that are open to adopting those policies and are receptive to it. But what we know is that for most systems, there isn't that kind of acceptance and willingness to adopt. And in fact, in some systems, it's almost completely anti-innovation, and any innovation that enters systems essentially gets destroyed. And our CEO, Patrick McCarthy, is fond of saying that systems trump programs all the time, right? So with the best intentions, the best intervention, if the system is not on board, then the program fails. And to me, that's an important lesson for implementation science and implementers and practitioners, is really understanding what is a context for how work actually works and what becomes effective. And the other point, what I hope to give you in the next few minutes is kind of the insights that I have from reading this literature and participating in this conversation about how do we at Annie Casey start implementing the evidence that we know in terms of improving outcomes for vulnerable children and their families. And one of the key lessons is that it's really hard to be generalizable in vulnerable communities and populations. Place matters a lot, neighborhoods matter a lot, systems matter a lot. So if you happen to live in a community that has a strong educational system or has a strong public health system, the outcomes that you might experience with the same intervention would vary. And I think that in this conversation, one of the things that we want to be mindful of is that when we think about implementation science and adaptation, which I'm glad that I think it was Diane who mentioned early on, really important issue. To any intervention really should be assessed through the lens of adaptation. You can't expect something that was done in one context for an RCT to actually have applicability in a multitude of other contexts without taking into some level of adaptation. And I think there's a temptation to see that adaptation as simply the issues of variability on race, ethnicity, or population, but it's much more than that. It has to do with beliefs and values and norms and just the experiences of the communities that is receiving that intervention. I'll say a little bit about another issue that's kind of keeping me up at night around this implementation science and evidence-based practice, and that is who's doing the evaluation, right? I heard Allison say the importance of building capital or capacity in those communities once the evaluators and the researchers leave, and I'm more interested in building the capacity for those who stay and stay behind. And so I think the issue of who evaluates and recognizing that there is a huge lack of diversity among the research and evaluation sector that makes implementation really difficult, and we need more diversity in the implementation science field. And it's important not just because of the perspectives that they bring and the relevance to the community, but it actually improves the quality of the assessment and the intervention. And that we know that from the research over and over again, that complex problems require heterogeneous thinking, right? And different folks targeting that same problem. And on the issue of adaptation, there is a kind of a debate on this, whether their adaptations of interventions are actually a threat to validity. I would encourage all of you who haven't read it to read an article by Dr. Laura Levitin on this issue of adaptation, and where she demonstrates that it actually makes the intervention stronger and more likely to be adopted by local context. And so, even within implementation science, there are debates around what's allowable in an adaptation and what's not. Can you tweak a curriculum? Can you tweak the dosage? And all these things that are mentioned before. And so I think about these issues. I think about where we're headed as a nation, and in terms of the shift in demographics and the diversity and the disparities and the kind of, a serious gap that exists in our knowledge about other forms of knowing. And I'm thinking in particular about, in working in Native American communities and Native American researchers, what's valued as scientific research in the general population is not necessarily what's valued in indigenous populations. So there's a lot of knowledge missing. And even though we at the Annie E. Casey Foundation have been funders of some major clearinghouses of evidence-based practice, and I would encourage you to check out the Blueprints in Colorado, which is a clearinghouse for evidence-based practice on youth development. Even an organization like Casey is concerned about the fact that of the 1,200 interventions that were assessed, only 53 made the cut and so are considered evidence-based. So in the context of, other ways of knowing, the lack of diversity, the damage already done to many vulnerable populations already with intervention thrown out them left and right, what can be said about a different kind of knowing that doesn't require a randomized control trial, right? And so I want us to think about implementation science as one mechanism to kind of make a contribution without being so tied to a false standard. There are other kinds of clearinghouses. There's California evidence-based clearinghouses that has about 350 interventions that are considered, evidence-based. But even within these collections, I would say they're limited because there's a lack of meaningful understanding of what it means to be evidence-based. There's a lack of focus on the process of implementation. There's there's different rankings and ratings, so you can't really compare what makes it on one blueprints and clearinghouse and what makes it in another. Some require RTCs or RCTs, some require peer-reviewed, others don't, and others rate replication as the standard. If you can test it somewhere else, is it effective? Is that more important than having done it with an RCT? So how do we advance this science? How do we move forward? So in my mind, a key role that we have as leaders in the evaluation sector is to train and mentor a new generation of researchers who really understand community. When I read the early literature in community-based participatory research, that's not very different from what we're reading today in implementation science, right? So I don't want to think that we're too kind of crazy innovative. I mean, this stuff we've known for many, many years. And we need to embrace those different modes of evaluation as part and parcel of this current movement in implementation science. I love the fact that Brian Mittman, I don't know if Brian is here, or maybe he's out there, started this implementation science journal that's online and open. I mean, it's, I want us to kind of recognize that the problem with the literature is that it's already biased toward sort of some result, right? So we don't know the stuff that's not working because it doesn't get published, right? So let's just, be mindful of what we're, what our subconscious is telling us every time we read an article about the 100 others that were turned down because there was a null finding. I would say the other important issue in terms of moving the science forward is really creating new methods of dissemination, like really getting beyond the journal per se. I mean, I'll highlight another online journal that I think is fabulous on public health services and systems research, run out of the University of Kentucky, and Dr. Glenn May's work based on public health practice-based research networks, where really thinking about other kinds of dissemination that aren't really tied to that peer-reviewed, wait a year and a half, maybe we'll publish your manuscript, and we all know that it takes 17 years from evidence to practice. And so I have some optimism that through implementation science we can shorten that. And the other thing I would encourage us to do as we either fund this research, and Allison made a great point about the value for the administration for children and families, is that we need to be thinking about how do we include the practitioners and the implementers into that research, right? So what's the perspective of the practitioner? It's like, I'm trying to do this, but the kids aren't engaged. So I adapted it and I did X instead, but still the outcome was the same in terms of their level of understanding of, sexual behavior, et cetera, et cetera. I'll just close with a couple of thoughts on how really acknowledging the role and the importance of adaptation, culture, community, informal leadership, not formal leadership. There's a lot of communities that I said earlier are inundated with all kinds of interventions, and it's not the formal leadership that is really informing and influencing whether they work. It's the informal leadership. So we need to kind of systematically understand how those local actors view and accept evidence-based interventions. We need to understand the importance of the implementer and how the implementer can contribute to a program effectiveness and outcomes. We need to anticipate and understand the process of adaptation through evaluation that can lead to improved guidance in the program and improved effectiveness. And we need to clarify what it means to be evidence-based by supporting all, as I said before, all types of evidence and the different kinds of knowing, particularly qualitative research, which this is why implementation science is exciting to me, because it honors the qualitative work and not just the very large data sets, big data, and quantitative work. So I think I'll stop there and turn to questions and just say that for Annie E. Casey, we have a whole unit dedicated to in encouraging the adoption of evidence-based practice in child welfare systems. And a big kind of learning moment for us was we were implementing this project in Providence, and our idea was if we could learn how a system like child welfare in Providence adopts evidence-based, then we can take that lesson and write these manuals and help other systems adopt evidence-based practice. And alas, what do you think we found out? when you've seen one system in child welfare, you've seen one system in child welfare. And so those lessons don't necessarily apply to other places. So, and then so what we're working on now at NEKC in terms of evidence-based practice is how do we fund those innovative, groundbreaking interventions that haven't received their RCT and their blue stamp of approval, and how do we help them go from a promising practice to something that has more data and more evidence of it actually working. And so I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
So at this time, I want to introduce our last reflection question. What do you think are the greatest threats to replicating or scaling up an evidence-based program or promising innovation? And I think by now you know what to do. If you're on the webinar, you can respond through the Q&A widget, and if you're here in person, you can write your question or your comment on a note card. So again, I want to thank all of our presenters. We had 3 terrific presentations. I think you all created a lot of synergy among your remarks, really built on each other nicely. In some ways, I think everything you talked about is related to our first question, but just thinking about all the presentations that you heard to get us going on our panel discussion, what do you think are really the most pressing implementation research questions at this time from your perspective? Would you like to start, Lauren?
So I think it's about thinking creatively about how to answer many of the pressing questions within their own trials and existing trials to sort of maximize learning as fast as we can. So I can't answer just one question.
Okay, Allison, you are really close to the field in the work that you're doing. You're really on the ground. Traveling almost all the time to different places, helping them implement. So from that perspective, what do you think are the most pressing questions that need to be answered?
We're not very smooth up here, as you can see, with the mics. It's interesting. I mean, you can kind of flip any of these things into a research question, but I think that probably 3 things that probably big points I was trying to make up there that I think are really critical is this idea of how do we do a better job of matching evidence to local context. And I mentioned that from a TA perspective in terms of how it is we really help communities conduct their own needs assessments and really understand the needs of their population. And so again, I think that there's been a little too much of kind of moving certain packages into certain jurisdictions without having done the job that's really needed to understand local context, local needs. And so I think how we do that better is an important piece. I think the second thing is how we really do create hospitable policy, regulatory, funding environment. So if you think about that driver's triangle I put up, I think we've learned a lot more in the last decade about the left side, how it is we build practitioner competency. There's been quite a bit of research, I think, done around training and coaching, and I think there's been a lot less research done around how it is we do effective, say, TQI, continuous quality improvement. How do we really optimize evidence in practice? I think we're starting to move away from the debate about kind of adaptation versus fidelity as much as, hopefully we are, as much as thinking about continuous quality improvement so that we're maximizing benefits for populations. And so I think that that's a really critical piece, and I think the more work needs to be done on that. And then the third thing is what I did mention throughout the talk and at the end, is this role of stakeholders, because it is really critical to understand how we sustain practice over time. So how is it we build capacity? certain resources provided in jurisdictions are time limited. And how do we better understand the transfer of certain aspects of an infrastructure? And I think that it is an empirical question. And I think that it's really critical that we build local capacity so we don't end up having jurisdictions totally dependent on outside consultants just so they can use evidence. I don't think that makes much sense, and I don't think we'll ever reach scale and socially significant outcomes if we do that. So I think there's a lot of good research questions, and some folks are doing that around social network analysis and other things that are really important to understand how people come together to really sustain what's best for their own communities. That was a long response.
Thank you, Allison.
See, it was like, if you don't get to say what you want up there, then you get to continue your talk, right?
Second chance. Okay, Deborah Joy, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, so, I think we need to emphasize not just the how and the what, but the who, and the who in community, as I said, is not just the folks who are in the formal leadership, but informal. I think about vulnerable children and their families, and at any given time, the same family might be involved in 10 different interventions because they're receiving, their kids in Head Start, they might be dealing with a substance abuse problem, they might be receiving TANF. There's a lot going on. And so I think that the authentic voice of those who are the intended recipient of the good is absent in the conversation around research and who gets to say. So, and then I guess the issue of diversity, and going back to building the capacity of evaluators, particularly evaluators of color from underrepresented populations, because we are increasingly diverse. And if you look at any most evaluation firms in the country, you will see very little diversity in terms of folks who have a different identity in socioeconomic, racial, sexual orientation, you name it. And I think these diverse perspectives are missing in this work. So I think that's a challenge, not just for implementation science, but a challenge for research and evaluation broadly.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to jump to one more question for the panel, and then we'll start bringing in comments from the audience. And anybody who wants to jump in on this one, feel free. But one of the questions that I get from my colleagues at Mathematica is, does implementation science just apply to evidence-based programs? What if I'm studying something that doesn't yet have an evidence base, or it's less well developed? How does implementation science apply to those types of studies and those types of programs?
So we're having implementation issues, actually. I personally think that implementation science is not limited to evidence-based programs. I mean, I think a lot of these questions we're really asking are about organizational capacity, functioning, sort of how do we put these things into place? And there's some emerging evidence that I'm fascinated by that says that some of these, much like Deborah Joy mentioned, that organizational capacity actually would trump an evidence-based program, and if you build organizational capacity, you actually get stronger impacts in an evidence-based program. So there's a lot of variables in there that I think we have to understand whether or not we're doing an evidence-based program in order to just build better service delivery.
Thank you. Anne, do we have any comments from the audience that you'd like to throw in?
Yeah, actually, there are several questions and comments that are coming in right around this exact issue. Folks are basically asking, how can you improve the capacity of policymakers and folks on the program side to be able to engage in this process of improving implementation and understanding it? And I'll just throw in a related comment that someone expressed. They felt that the policymakers and the program folks didn't necessarily understand or appreciate the need for research, and that it's all part of a package. So the question is, how do you get those folks on board? How do you build their capacity? And is there something to be said about bringing folks up to speed on the research methodology?
I'll take a stab at that. And I'd start with make it easy for them. Give them what they want, which is, they don't want the 25-page paper. They want the one-page brief that gives the punchline and tells them how to use the information. At the Annie Casey Foundation, we're currently, in fact, it's happening today through Thursday, holding our 25th anniversary of our Kids Count report, which is a data set that's focused on children's well-being all over the country. It's a state-by-state report. And in February, we released a report focused on race, ethnicity, and disparity called Race for Results. And the strategy for that work, which I think from what we're hearing from our partners in the policy sector, has been pretty dramatic in terms of uptake in not just the sharing of the results, but policymakers using that data to make the case in their communities for resources in education and health, in issues related to juvenile justice, in issues related to disparities, particularly in the current conversation around young boys and men of color, right? So I think what policymakers' appreciation for data only goes as far as they've been able to capitalize and use it for their own agenda. And so, I'm a big Kingdon fan, so, be there. There's a policy window, slap, some policy briefs and some data and help them make their case by providing the information and the research in a way that's helpful to them.
How about on the program side? Maybe Allison, you might have thoughts on that.
I think how we engage in terms of using evidence on the program side, I think it really honestly comes back to how we define evidence, because I do think that evidence comes in different forms, and it was interesting, as Deborah Joy was talking about different ways of knowing. I think the way that you engage folks on a program side or on a practice level around the use of evidence is by entering very respectfully into an engagement process with jurisdictions that does engage that diversity of opinion. You want competing yet legitimate perspectives. If you do a needs assessment with all convergence, sometimes that to me is a bit of a red flag, because I'm thinking, well, that's really interesting that this entire community agrees on what it is they need. A lot of times you want to have that dialogue and that divergent perspective and really respect that, and also respect the fact that there are evidence-based practices and programs, but if something is not rated as an evidence-based program, it doesn't mean it's not evidence, that there's not evidence to it. Typically what it means is it hasn't yet been evaluated in that community with the outcomes that that community wants to achieve. And so it's really that engagement process I think matters so much, and the idea of how it is you do that needs assessment process with them.
Great. Do you have another question?
Yeah, actually, there's a follow-on question to that precise point, and that is, when there is a divergence of opinion about the needs assessment or the diagnosis phase, how do you resolve that in terms of what program ought to be implemented and the way you think about evaluating it?
Would you like to take that one, Allison? I think that one's yours.
I think this goes back to some of those questions of building that capacity around how it is you do a comprehensive iterative needs assessment, because really what you want is to cast a really wide net first. And I think always want to start with qualitative data, and that's where a lot of times you see the diversity, which allows you to generate some hypotheses. And then it's how it is you go into data, available data, whether it's administrative data, other types of data that allow you to confirm or not some of those hypotheses. How it is you address barriers to care. So if this is a need, why is that need not being met? How it is you engage local opinion leaders, so not just traditional experts, but opinion leaders in the community to shed light on that evidence. And so typically it's a 5, 6, 7-step process that should build on each other, and each of those iterative components should allow you to come to some consensus. I'm not saying it's always that easy, but many times we kind of short shrift a needs assessment process and kind of do those first couple pieces. A lot of times what you see for a needs assessment is simply administrative data is looked at, and you don't see the qualitative piece. Once you engage in the qualitative piece, many times that's an intervention in itself, and that allows people to start to think about it. But multiple data sources is an absolute critical key to gaining consensus.
Let me, I'm sorry,
Can I
go
just
ahead.
add something to that, and that is, you know, it's a similar story. Getting the community to agree on a particular intervention depends on what they think they're getting from the intervention. You know, sometimes if there's enough evidence to prove that the particular intervention is a priority over another, then there's some conversation and agreement about what gets done first. But again, the question is, how does the community feel that it's benefiting from that work, and how do you demonstrate that? And you know, just to reflect a little on the prior question about, you should be doing continuous quality improvement, you know, continuous monitoring of process and performance, whether it's an RCT or not. And I think often we miss the opportunity to kind of study failure, what works and what didn't work, because failure has a lot of embedded lessons, and I think that too often we don't want to acknowledge failure. So you know, there are lots of opportunities to go deeper than the requirements for an RCT, and I would say that something that's missing, and certainly in the literature, the standard literature, that doesn't account for what's happening in terms of the process or in the black box, is regularly tracking short-term goals. Like, we don't have to wait till we have the final outcome that says population X was better, but what are the more, you know, shorter-term milestones in between that shows the community that they're making progress? Because if you test something and you don't get back to them for 6 months, a year, 18 months, then there's that opportunity is lost to show that what is being done is actually benefiting the community.
Great. Should we get a question from the web now?
I actually was going to have one more combined question that actually I think comes from two different people on the webinar. And it's directed, I think, more to Lauren and Deborah Joy. As funders of programs, when you're determining what to fund, and you're thinking about especially evidence-based programs, to what extent are you thinking about them as sort of effective at the population level, sort of a broad population, or do you think about them in terms of more specific communities? And if it's the latter, how do you get from a more specific community to a broader community? How are you thinking about the sort of population versus local community issue?
So, that when we have some work going on right now related to external validity, because you know, I think we're tasked many times with either doing the impact trial or the systematic review that sort of looks at the evidence of available effectiveness. But it's only as applicable broadly to a broad set of communities or to a population level change as we have evidence towards that. And there are huge gaps in our knowledge right now. And I think we'll never be able to do trials on every population in every setting. So figuring out how generalizable are the findings, what elements we feel pretty confident could cross settings, which ones are going to be more specific. But all of these, I think, are empirical questions that involve both the research community and the practice community in order to answer. So I think we're making baby steps in that direction, but.
So that to me sounds like a question of scale, right? So
Yeah.
for us, it's how the exact question: how generalizable would the findings be to the broader population that's suffering from the same outcomes that this particular intervention is trying to address? So, you know, because there are limited resources, we have to make investments based on their ability to transform the outcomes that we want to transform on a broader scale, on a national level. Having said that, it's doubtful that even in the small N populations, the study, that any evaluation has taken place at all. So let me give you an example. So I was involved and really excited to participate with our president, Patrick McCarthy, on the national effort to look at boys and men of color. And we looked at the literature to see what was available in terms of research. And there was a scan done of, I would say, something like 50 or so interventions. And very, very few, I want to say less than 10 had actually been evaluated, right? So there are a lot of interventions happening nationally on extremely vulnerable populations with zero evaluation, right? And that's problematic. And if you want to make a change at a broader scale, you have to have some level of evaluation that tells you how this intervention can be applied. So there's tons of, I think, opportunity in terms of finding the connection between any local intervention with a state-level intervention with a national. I think it's really a matter of looking at the population you're serving to see how that intervention and that population might be extrapolated, to larger populations. But ultimately, as funders, and because of limited resources, we are going to have to fund those things that have the potential to have the greatest impact.
Right, right. Do you want to?
Okay, Crystal, do we have any other questions from the web?
Question. At times there appear to be tensions between evaluation research and performance management. What role does performance management have in implementation science?
All right, so I'm going to take that one only because we're in the midst of a huge kind of performance management system development project. And we actually, at the NEKC Foundation, require every grantee to submit with their proposal their performance measures, right? To me, it's one and the same. Having performance measures is part of an evaluation. You don't know where you're headed unless you have some measure, some metric or milestone that you're trying to achieve. At Casey, we are very much kind of on board with the results-based accountability framework, which teaches us to be very specific about the curves we're trying to turn and how we're going to turn them in terms of making sure that we're very specific about those performance measures. So, the good thing about performance measures is that you can have kind of, short-term, intermediate, and long-term measures, and you can keep your eye on the horizon for, like, say, a national indicator, right, for something that you're hoping to influence, but you're not 100% accountable for. You can take that that horizon or that promising indicator and see how your program is impacting that indicator at a local level. So I think it's critical to do both.
Okay, Lauren.
There you go.
So I think they answer different questions. I totally agree. They're both critical. They answer different questions, and that they're both important sets of questions, and that you can use performance measurement at a local level to monitor implementation. You can use it to examine implementation. You can even use it. I've seen some communities using it to actually rigorously test questions. If we change this element in practice, does it actually change our performance measures? And you can even randomize service delivery people to different ways of doing it. And then evaluation can complement it. Evaluation tends to look more generalizable than the performance measures for a specific program. But I think they're both critical to advancing the field, and we've got to figure out a way to pull the information out from both sets of data to continue to advance questions.
Great, and I think Allison has something to add as well.
One small thing, which is, and we've talked about this before, is fostering the curiosity of jurisdictions to wonder about how things are going, and so I think whether it's evaluation or whether it's performance management, I think both of those things should really engage a site to be curious, because we want to build the capacity of sites to always think about how it is they could use different forms of information to help them more deeply understand how they're progressing, how they might need to improve, what action steps they might need to take, and once they take those action steps, how can they assess whether those actions had the intended effects they hoped it would have. And so I think benchmarks, like federal benchmarks and things like that, I think have been helpful in terms of those early milestones. But what we don't want to happen is, whether it's with evaluation or benchmarks, that we're putting something that feels irrelevant onto a jurisdiction, and we want it to feel absolutely relevant to them. So I always ask a jurisdiction, what keeps you up at night? How can I help you think about that? Rather than kind of coming in with other things, if that makes sense.
Right. Good.
Do you have something else? Does anyone in the audience have a question that you'd like to ask the panel?
Now that we stole your question cards.
Well, I have a question. We've already started touching on it. It got me thinking about it. You know, there's a debate between what's the relative importance of maintaining fidelity to the model versus adaptation for local conditions. I think we heard both Allison and Deborah Joy making a plug for the importance of fit with the local community. And it's not just about characteristics of the population. You know, there are a lot more factors that are involved in that. So I guess I'm interested in hearing the panelists' thoughts on that, number one. And number two, if you think that some adaptation is a good idea, how do you make sure it's not what I've heard referred to as a fatal mutation? It's really a helpful adaptation that's going to improve outcomes. It's not going to actually, wreck the program. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
I actually was at a meeting once, and I think it was Mark Chafin, but I'm not sure, who said you have to distinguish between adaptation and drift. That adaptation actually can improve the program. People sometimes lump those things together, but I think there's lots of ways. First, building the empirical evidence of core components and core elements, exploring things like we were talking about Bruce Torpedo before the panel started. And then also, this comes back to the performance management question, right? If you're going to adapt a program, there are many people out there who say, start implementing as it was designed, and then if things start going ways that you don't think are well, collect data, ask the question, look at it. Don't just start changing things, but really build that curiosity towards improvement. But I think that the field is really on this continuum. It's not really. I don't see people any longer really duking it out over fidelity or adaptation. It's really a continuum.
Okay. Deborah Joy?
I agree completely, and good implementation research accounts for adaptation, and particularly in public health interventions are stronger if they take those adaptations to local conditions into account. I think the important thing is to be systematic in the documentation of that adaptation and to know what those core elements there should be a conversation and agreement. These things can't change. Everything else related to cultural context, related to the community, to the system, the institution may change. But the important thing is that even when those things change, they have to be documented. The challenge, and I think this is related to the drift point, is that if you don't systematically kind of document and evaluate these adaptations, then you do risk kind of this losing the power of the generalizability, right? Or you have they become individual interventions, and then in order to make some sense of it, you have kind of this race to the bottom of what is the minimum of the intervention, which really waters it down. So.
I wanted to just tag on to that. I think Brian Blumbarger and some of his colleagues have done some work that have kind of demonstrated that what you said around drift, that actually a lot of adaptations are reactionary or opportunistic, and they've been, and so he has a study that kind of documents that, and I found that really compelling because change is not bad, it just needs to be purposeful. That's the key to that PDSA that's been in the literature since 1924 that we just can't seem to get, is that it's purposeful, and if it's purposeful and we study it and we work in collaboration with the local site to optimize their practice, then I think we're onto something, and that's categorically different than drift or the typical debate that we have.
Any questions from the audience? Yes, He's going to bring you a microphone. Just hang on one second.
Cheryl Vince from the American Institutes for Research. I think one of the challenges we see too in supporting the implementation is, you commented, Allison, about package programs, and it seems that the rosters of evidence-based programs we have over the years either have developers who then go on to do more research and leave them, and so then it's up to others to implement, or we have people who have made a commercial venture out of it who then are receiving federal funding in a very self-promotional way to get that singular vertical program out, when that may be of value, but it may not. It may be too packaged and too insular. And I would just wonder about your, whatever panelists would want to respond, whether you see this too, and how we all providing either technical assistance or evaluation deal with, you know, the drivers of who's putting the programs out there and where the money is coming from to support them.
Yeah. Any takers?
I'm being delegated to question. So, you know, it's important to remember that, you know, there's, to me, you'd have to look at the motivation, right? And so, yes, there are a lot of developers out there who, you know, the intervention is, or their particular intervention is the hammer to every problem, the nail is every problem. So I think the only thing to do is to be mindful of that and to ask the funder for some flexibility in terms of adapting for the particular community in the context, and be prepared to provide evidence as to how come. You know, is this a particularly transient population, or is there, you know, something that doesn't translate, if there's a language barrier. The important thing to remember is that developers and implementers are both acting, essentially when you do the intervention, they act independently, you know, and they both are independent, in fact, of the communities that they're trying to help. So that's like the third element there. So I would say acknowledge it and raise questions about how do you do or implement and still be faithful to the community context.
I just pick up on that. I think a funder perspective was important on that, but also one of the things I think about a lot is not leading with a model, but leading with a theory of change. And so I think that that's one of the challenges we have faced with I can't tell you how many projects we've been involved in that we've definitely led with the model. You can retrofit almost any model into a logic model and it works well because they all produce good outcomes that are fairly similar when you're working with populations. And so if you don't see that robust needs assessment, you don't see that collaboration with the developer and those kinds of things, but I really like to see a very strong conceptual theory of change. I like to see underlying assumptions, conditions that need to be met, and that you shouldn't be looking at models till honestly months into a needs assessment process. And I think I can't tell you how many jurisdictions that we visit that have already selected their models. And so I think that's the key. And then the other piece is that evidence takes many different forms. There are evidence-based programs, evidence-based practices. Those are two different things. Common elements, evidence-based kernels, which are different than common elements. So if, you know, from a public health perspective, these all definitely mean different things. And I think we know less about how to implement, honestly, the common elements piece and some of that. I think implementation science grew with the evidence-based program movement. I think the knowledge of that's expanded, but how it is we utilize some of these science-based techniques to move a variety, a range, a diversity of evidence into practice is something the field really has to work closely on, because you could work in a jurisdiction and a program works really well for a certain subpopulation, but it's not a proxy for general capacity. So there's still, and many times you see EBMs moved in as a proxy for general capacity. And if you want high quality practice, many times you're looking at common elements, and the programs are playing a role in certain pieces of your service system, if that makes sense. So it's an integrated use of evidence in different forms. And I think that takes some nuanced expertise to really work with the jurisdiction on how to do that.
Right.
Okay, well, I think we are almost out of time. I'm going to call on Anne to close us out, but I just want to thank all our panelists and thank the audience for your great questions.
All right. Yes, so thank you everyone for participating, both those of you here in our Washington, D.C. office and the folks on the webinar. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. For those of you here in D.C., again, I'll invite you to stick around for the networking reception that'll be in the lobby. And there's actually, if you want to share your additional questions or reflections that you might have written down as conversation starters, we have an easel out there and push pins, and you can put those up there. Please be sure to let us know what you think, how we did. For those of you in the room, please complete your comment card that's in your packet. And those of you on the webinar, please complete our electronic survey. Finally, I hope you'll all attend our next CIRE Forum, which is tentatively scheduled for January 22nd, and will focus on evidence-based programmatic technical assistance. So thank you once again.